aces of the tarot deck, they seem kind of unassuming, but they are very important cards. They carry a lot of wisdom and a lot of power, and they are what we are going to talk about today as we continue exploring the 8 core cards in the tarot deck. This is part 2 of our 2-part exploration of the 8 core cards in the tarot deck. So if you have not already heard part 1, you can either be a rebel and listen to part 2 first, and there's nothing wrong with that, or you can go back to the podcast archives and check out the previous episode where we talked about the first 4 core cards. In the previous episode, we were focusing on the core cards that come from the major arcana portion of the tarot deck. We talked about the Fool, the Magician, the High Priestess, and the World. And that conversation, first of all, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. And as I said in the episode itself, there's so much more to say. This is what I love about tarot. It never really ends, the amount of digging and the amount of considering that you can do with the cards. But I feel like we laid some good groundwork, and I hope that that conversation brought something valuable to you. In a lot of texts and tarot teachings, the major arcana cards do sometimes get more attention than the minor arcana cards. And I can see why. The major arcana tap into these central aspects of the human experience, and they tap into metaphor, they tap into archetypes, they tap into deep spiritual wisdom, they tap into psychological concepts. So I can see why they're often given such diligent consideration when you study tarot. But the minor arcana portion of the deck is every bit as essential to helping us look at the overall experience of what it is to be human. The minor arcana cards describe the ways in which we embody these big sweeping spiritual themes of the major arcana and take those principles and integrate them into what we do, how we feel, what we think about, and all of these other aspects of the way that we actually live and show up in the world every day and every moment. So they may not seem as glamorous at first glance as the major arcana cards, but they are very essential and they cover some really meaningful lessons. As it has been my aim to make these podcasts relevant for you no matter what your level of tarot knowledge is, I'm going to dip just for a moment into some more kind of tarot 101 type stuff. So if you're more familiar with the deck, hopefully this will be just a bit of a refresher, but if you're new to tarot, this might be useful for you to keep in mind. So we already kind of talked about this, but the tarot deck is composed of 2 main sections. Of course, the major arcana, 4 of those which we talked about in our last episode, and there are 22 cards in the major arcana. The remaining 56 out of the 78 cards in the tarot deck are from the minor arcana, including the 4 aces. From there, the minor arcana is composed of 4 suits, and most commonly the suits are given the names wands, pentacles, swords, and cups. There are so many decks out there, and some of them use different terminology. Older decks might call pentacles coins, or even some newer decks for that matter. Wands are sometimes known as batons, and then there's all kinds of decks that spin these 4 suits in all kinds of other creative directions as well. But the most common names that they go by again would be wands, pentacles, swords, and cups. And then within each of these 4 suits, there are the cards ace through 10 plus 4 court cards. Now the court cards, let's put a pin in that, because a very soon upcoming episode I'm going to talk about court cards and how they tie into your self-discovery. Each of the 4 suits of the major arcana show the various ways that you process your daily life through a few different ways of perception. So through your feelings, through your thoughts, through your sensations, and through what I call your passion. Again, as I just mentioned, that makes a total of 56 cards in the minor arcana, which is a lot of cards. But the reason that I consider the aces to be part of the core 8 cards in the tarot deck is that when you dive into the aces and when you are able to study them quite intensely, understanding every other card within the minor arcana clicks into place a lot more naturally. So that's why these aces are part of what I consider to be the core 8 cards in the tarot deck, and they are what we're going to be jumping into in some level of detail from here. Before I go too much deeper, I want to reiterate something that I talked about in the previous episode. There are 78 cards in the deck as a whole, and even though I consider the 8 cards we've been focusing on to be the core cards of the deck, that is not to say that every card is not crucial. The tarot is a system, and each member of that system plays a particular role in the functioning as a whole. However, I think the reason that this concept of looking at these core 8 cards is so useful is that these 8 cards do a lot of the heavy lifting. These 8 cards set the tone for what follows in the rest of the cards, and they are kind of, as I described in our past episode, they are like the load-bearing walls of the tarot deck. They are what sets the foundation for the rest of the messages and wisdom of the cards to unfold. And that's why I think there's so much value in putting some particular study and concentration into these 8 cards, particularly. Getting into the heart of the matter, let's talk about these 4 aces. To begin with, I think it would be useful for us to cover some stuff, some information that applies to all of the aces. I found that the most straightforward way to understand the aces, what it means to actually be an ace, regardless of the suit, is that the ace is like a seed. So each ace is a seed, and that seed then contains the potential for the entire rest of the suit's cards. So I know that sounds kind of hokey, but it is a metaphor that is used often in tarot texts, and it's used often for a reason because it's a very useful way to think about the aces. So think about, for example, say when you plant an apple seed. This apple seed is just this tiny little unassuming thing, but that apple seed contains the potential for every twig, every piece of bark, every leaf and shoot and fruit that will then be able to emerge. The seed was where that all began. This is really very much how the aces function in a tarot deck. They are they're sort of that first point of concentrated energy from which the various manifestations of each suit is then able to spring forward. Now that we've talked a little bit about aceness, or really what it is to actually be an ace regardless of the suit, let's go back to a concept I mentioned earlier, which is that each of these 4 suits shows the various ways that you interpret the world around you. So the 4 suits show how you understand reality, how you interact with other people, how you interact with yourself, your struggles, your triumphs, your strengths, your weaknesses, all of that. I'll break that down briefly, suit by suit, and then we'll go in depth on each of these. Swords represent your thoughts, your mental realm. Wands represent your passion, your life force, your gusto. Cups represent your feelings, your emotional realm. And pentacles represent your senses, your body, the way you interpret the world through your 5 senses. This is something you'll often see referenced in tarot literature, this idea of linking each of the 4 suits to a kind of keyword to represent what that suit is all about. And again, those for me would be swords, thoughts, wands, passion, cups, feelings, and pentacles, senses. Let's go ahead now and look at each of those in greater detail. The Ace of Swords. That's what we're going to dive into first, but keep in mind, as I already mentioned earlier, these are in no particular order. There's not a hierarchy within these four cards. So let's talk about the Ace of Swords. I think you could consider the Ace of Swords to show the entire potential of your mental realm. So thinking it's crucial to living your life in this world. In every moment, your conscious mind as well as your unconscious mind, in every moment they are at work processing stimuli. They are working through information. They are informing everything that you do for better or for worse, for help or for harm. The thoughts are always there and they are important. They are essential to being human. The Ace of Swords teaches you that when you can get a good understanding of your thoughts and when you can maintain an awareness of your thoughts, you can then learn to navigate your mental energy consciously and effectively instead of just letting it run on autopilot. The Ace of Swords again shows the potential for anything to do with your mental realm. So this could include the potential for developing your intelligence, looking at the world through a logical and rational lens. The Ace of Swords is the potential for you to have a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you through your mental processes. The Ace of Swords is the potential for your clarity, and it's the potential really for any kind of constructive thought pattern that helps you navigate the world effectively. But at the same time, the Ace of Swords also has the potential for your fallacies, for confusion, for false assumptions, illusions, destructive thought patterns. So it's the potential again for this whole spectrum of your mental realm. The Ace contains that entire potential. Within the Ace of Swords itself, none of those particular manifestations are yet happening. Again, this is just the seed for that entire potential of that whole range of your mental realm. Something that applies to all of the aces is that as you see the suit start to unfold when you go into cards 2 through 10, you then see that ace's potential playing out in detail. When you really get that the ace represents this entire spectrum of potential, and when you start to really consider what manifestations that potential could come up in, then when you look at the rest of the cards in the suit, you have this easier ability to have these aha moments of seeing, oh yes, we saw that potential in the ace, and now this card is describing how that potential is unfolding. This is why I consider the four aces to be core cards, because they set that tone and show that potential that unfolds throughout the rest of that suit. That was a bit of a digression, but Ace of Swords, as we talked about, Ace of Swords in a nutshell is that seed of potential for the entire range of your mental realm. Let's talk about the Ace of Wands next. And for full disclosure, I want to tell you that this may sound kind of weird or funny. It's probably not a very common experience, but for me, Wands is the hardest suit to really describe. Everything else just kind of it seems pretty straightforward to me, especially in terms of the keywords that we use to talk about the cards. So Ace of Swords is really straightforward. It's about thoughts in your mental realm. Ace of Wands, the suit of Wands itself, I've seen such a variety of sort of key phrases that people associate with what the suit of Wands represents. So I've seen people describe it as creative energy, I've seen people describe it as like enthusiasm or excitement. Creative energy might be the most common thing I've seen people attribute to the suit of Wands. I personally believe that all of these suits speak to our creative energy. I don't think creativity is restricted to one particular suit. The most fitting phrase that I have come up with to ascribe to the suit of wands is passionate. The wands to me are about excitement, life force, and passion. So just again a bit of a digression, but just so you know, that's the way that I have best found to think about what the suit of wands represents. That being said, you could think of the Ace of Wands as the potential of your passionate energy. The Ace of Wands contains your potential to navigate life by seeking out the things that motivate you and excite you. The Wands show your drive to be more than just alive. The Wands are your drive to thrive and to be passionately engaged with your experiences. There's a lot of movement at work in the Wands cards. And one thing that I'm not going into very much in what we've talked about so far is the elemental associations of the cards. I might have to do that in a future episode, but the Wands elemental association is with fire, and Wands are very much this active, this dynamic type of suit. One's energy can be quite erratic and it can be all over the place, but the Ace of Wands teaches you that you do have the ability to come to grips with your passionate energy and use it in an effective way, just like we talked about with the Ace of Swords, showing your ability to understand your mental energy and use that in an effective, conscious way. At its best, the Ace of Wands contains the potential for your adventures, your boldness, your confidence, your success, and your grit. But the Ace of Wands also contains the potential for your irritability, even your arrogance or a sense of grandiosity, and even fatigue and overwhelm. So again, the ace itself is merely the potential of all of these things, and you see those specifics unfold as you go through the numbered cards within that suit of wands. Let's now turn our attention to the Ace of Pentacles. The Ace of Pentacles is the potential of your senses. So pentacles are a very physical suit, and sometimes people describe this suit as being mundane. And the word mundane sometimes has negative connotations, but your mundane senses are crucial and they can, in fact, themselves be a form of magic. You make your way through life by using your physical senses, things like sight, sound, taste, and touch. And the Ace of Pentacles also shows the potential for other aspects of your material existence. So things like your body, your relationship with the material things in your life. They also show the way you work with any kind of tangible resource. So, of course, that includes money, but it also includes your time, your physical energy, all of that type of thing. On the, I guess you could say, more positive side of its spectrum, the Ace of Pentacles contains the potential for your sense of material security, for your abundance and your constructive habits, your generosity, your structured routines that really support you. But this card also shows your potential for lack, for maybe even being greedy, for spending your time in unhealthy ways, indulging in unhealthy habits, and tendencies to remain stuck in your comfort zone. All of those potentials of your sensory realm and your material experiences are contained in the Ace of Pentacles. And now on to the Ace of Cups. On a personal note, I love all of the aces. The one that I connect perhaps the most naturally with is the Ace of Cups. Again, I'm not going a lot into the elemental associations here, but the cups are associated with the suit of water. I am a water sign astrologically. My sign is Cancer. And I found that cups are probably the suit that I connect the most naturally with. And you might experience something similar in that there are perhaps certain suits from the minor arcana that you just get and they just click with you more naturally. And then there may be other suits that you have to spend more time contemplating and coming to terms with. I think that's completely natural. I think it's something a lot of us experience. So if that does happen to you, just know that totally normal. In fact, it ties into a psychological theory, which I think I'm going to talk more about in a few moments. So I don't need to be getting ahead of myself here. We'll get to that. We'll get to that soon. So let's talk about the Ace of Cups first. You can think of the Ace of Cups as the potential for your feelings, the potential of your emotional realm. You are you're largely influenced by feelings as you make your way through life. In fact, we humans like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, but there's more and more evidence that shows that we are actually incredibly influenced by our gut instincts and our feelings, more so than some of us even think we are. So when you become more consciously aware of these ever fluctuating feelings that you have, you can turn to your feelings for guidance and for inspiration. So at its best, the Ace of Cups contains the potential for your empathy towards others, your sense of belonging, joy, your ideals, your visions, your dreams. But this card also shows your potential for feeling disconnected, for experiencing more difficult or heavier feelings like sorrow or apathy. That whole sweeping spectrum of your emotional realm, all of that potential is contained there in the Ace of Cups. Now that we've talked a bit about each of these four aces, I want to reiterate some things that I've already dipped into a few times, so hopefully I'm not too much of a broken record here, but it bears repeating that the aces are the potential. Say it with me, they're the seed, they're the potential. I know, I've said that about a bajillion times already. So when you draw an ace for yourself, when you're seeing an ace come up, it is likely an indicator that the potential maybe has not yet taken a specific direction. And what's really important to note about this is that the aces tie into your role in consciously harnessing the energy of each suit. In fact, in many decks, including the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot, the aces are illustrated by a hand with the token of the suit. The hand I have come to think of as symbolizing your ability to wield the energy of that suit with intention. Again, instead of just letting things happen on autopilot, the aces show your ability to live intentionally with the energy of these suits. Your ability to wield the energy with intention starts with the ace, but also extends into all of the cards. And this is why there are no quote unquote good or bad tarot cards. In the numbered cards of each suit, you will definitely encounter some cards that are more difficult, that are heavier, that may be more unruly, you could say. But no matter which card you're considering within the numbered cards of the suit, you can always return to that potential that started with the ace, which is the potential for you to work with that energy intentionally. So tarot is it's definitely not about robbing you of your personal power. It is about Actually, it's about connecting you and plugging you in and returning you again and again to your personal power. And I think of the aces as a prime example of you connecting with that autonomy and you stepping into your ability to live intentionally. Let's switch gears a bit now, and we're going to talk about something that ties back into our last episode when we talked about the magician and the high priestess. And I described the way that the magician is more of this principle of being active, and the high priestess is more of the principle of receptivity. So, those themes of activity and receptivity continue into the four tarot suits and in turn the four aces. Wands and swords are often thought of as more active suits, where pentacles and cups are thought of as more receptive. I want to really enunciate that being receptive does not mean being passive, okay? And that applies to what we talked about with the magician and the high priestess as well. Receptivity is not the same thing as being passive. Instead, receptivity is more to do with being than it is to do with doing or taking action. So, cards that have a more receptive energy, I generally think of them as being more about embodying that energy and sort of radiating it from within rather than being necessarily about taking direct action. I hope that makes sense. That's a common thing that I see people fall into, is assuming that receptivity means being passive, and that is not necessarily the case. I want to draw your attention to the imagery, particularly if you are familiar with the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. I've mentioned this deck many times already, and of course, that is because it is sort of this iconic tarot deck that has informed a lot of the direction that future decks have gone in. And this is something that I noticed for myself when I first started studying the aces more in depth. So I was very proud of myself. I'm probably not the first person to have noticed this by any means, but I thought it was kind of a cool observation. In this deck, each of the four aces contains a hand in the imagery. When you look at the Ace of Wands and the Ace of Swords, these are the suits that are more active, that are more linked to that magician principle of activity. And in these suits, in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck, the hand is actively holding on to the suit. The hand is actively yielding the suit, grasping onto the suit. When you look now at the Ace of Cups and the Ace of Pentacles, as opposed to being kind of grasping on to the suit, in these two cards, the hand is palm up and the hand is receiving the energy of that suit. So that's just a little visual cue that ties into these principles. These associations of activity and receptivity, they're just to give you a framework for understanding the cards. Just like we talked about in our last episode, the ultimate message of the tarot deck is not one of duality, it's one of unity, and all of these cards are part of the same whole, but that whole does manifest in various ways, including ways that you can think of as active or receptive. Earlier, I hinted to some psychological frameworks that can be applied to these four aces, so I want to talk about that more in depth here now. There is a framework that was proposed by Carl Jung in which he described the four functions of your ego. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about what your ego is, so just suffice it to say that your ego is sort of the driver's seat of how you move through the world. For this context, like we talked about in our last episode, the ego itself is neither good nor bad. It's just a necessary psychological function of being a human, is having an ego. So Carl Jung proposed that there are these four functions of the ego, and each of these functions inform the way that you understand your reality and the way that you interact with your reality. The four ego functions that Carl Jung laid out are feeling, thinking, intuition, and sensation. Now, when I first started studying tarot a few years ago, I had a moment of being very proud of myself because I came to the conclusion on my own. I thought, these four suits of the tarot cards correspond perfectly to Jung's four functions. Well, as I continued my tarot studies, I found out I am by no means the first person to notice that there is a correlation there. There is a reason that you will find so many tarot readers who are fascinated by Jung and his theories because you can see a lot of his theories mirrored in the structure of the tarot deck. It probably goes without saying, but let's walk through how each of these four functions tie into the four suits of the tarot. Thinking, of course, seems to correlate to swords. Feeling naturally corresponds to cups. Sensation, of course, correlates with pentacles. And that leaves intuition to correlate with the suit of wands. From there, Jung proposed that each of these four functions of the ego form two pairs that show some sense of polarity in the ways that they interpret reality. So I guess I wouldn't go as far as saying that they are opposites, but they show sort of this tension at work in the ways that we perceive the world. Those pairs would be, first of all, thinking and feeling, and then the second pair would be sensation and intuition. This probably makes sense to you even just on a pragmatic level from what you've witnessed about yourself and other human beings in the world. That, for example, if you encounter a person who is very much sees the world primarily in a swords way, they're a very rational, logical person, it comes naturally to follow that the cups way of interacting with the world sometimes is not quite as developed in that person. And the other way around, I can say this from personal experience that I am, as I talked about earlier, I am primarily, I think, a cups person, and sometimes the thinking function shown by the suit of swords comes a bit less naturally to me. And then, of course, that goes as well with sensation and intuition. With all of that, I was getting a little bit ahead of myself because I wanted to mention that each of us uses all of these ego functions. We all use the modalities of thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. But Jung further proposed that each of us have a dominant function, and then we have functions that are perhaps less developed. So, as I kind of already alluded to, my dominant function is feeling, and thinking is my less developed function. It's one that I've had to put more effort or more intention, I guess you could say, into developing that particular function within myself. Thinking and feeling are perhaps more straightforward to understand in this sense. So let's take a moment to talk more about intuition and sensation because I think those two perhaps don't come quite as naturally for a lot of people to understand what they're referring to. I don't want to cause too much confusion here, but when I talked about the Ace of Wands earlier, I used the keyword passion, whereas now when we're talking about the Jung's four functions, the keyword is intuition. So I want to clarify that just a little bit. The suit of wands ties into this mode of perceiving the world through intuition because it is passionate, because the passion in the suit of wands is about the way that we move through the world based on our gut reactions. This isn't necessarily things that are practical, as would be exemplified by the suit of pentacles. These are things that you could use the term light you up from within. So this is why I think that the suit of wands, even though I used the keyword passion earlier, does correlate really nicely with Jung's concept of the function of intuition. Whereas again, pentacles would be more about the ego function of sensation in terms of navigating the world based on the actual information in front of you that is tangible. Wands is more about navigating the world based on the information that comes from some kind of spark within you. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So, if you are more developed in your function of sensation, this means that you are more developed at understanding the world through your actual senses, through your powers of observation, through what you see happening around you. Whereas intuition is more about processing the world based upon what is happening within you, based upon your intuitive responses to what is happening in the world, rather than necessarily your responses that are based on tangible evidence and tangible things that are laid out upon you in your physical reality. It's about the things that are apparent to you within your intuitive reality or your inner reality. I hope I'm doing any amount of justice to explaining these concepts. I am certainly not an expert in this, so please do not take what I say as gospel. This is just based on my understanding of some of these theories from the reading and the studying that I have done. But if you're interested in this, there's a lot of good resources, and you can actually read Jung's work directly to come to more of a solid understanding of this stuff. But there's some resources online as well, so I'll link to some stuff in the show notes. As you've been listening to me talk about all of this, or perhaps through what you've already encountered in your tarot studies so far, you may already know which one of these suits represents the ego function that is most highly developed for you. And that ties into what I talked about earlier, which is that for many of us, we find that there are certain suits in the tarot that we understand much more naturally. This is often because those suits tie into the functions that we have more highly developed within ourselves. Something else that I've noticed just in speaking with people about tarot and considering my own experience with the aces and the suits in the minor arcana is that Jung also proposed that although we all utilize all of these four functions, there's typically one of these four functions which is primarily unconscious within us. And I think that is why you'll hear a lot of tarot readers say that there is one particular suit of the minor arcana that they really, really, really struggle to connect with and understand. So, this is another interesting way you can use the tarot as a tool for self discovery by thinking about which of these four aces just seems the most difficult for you to sink into and understand. And perhaps that is a clue that this is the function that is perhaps the most unconscious within you. All of these ego functions are equally valid in informing the way that we interpret the world, that we understand the world, and that we make our way through the world. And sometimes people fall into the trap of thinking that whichever way is more developed within them is the superior way. So I think that there's a powerful lesson here for us to realize that all of these different modes of perceiving reality contribute something valuable to the overall human experience. They are all within our capacity as human beings for a reason, and I think we are wise to find the most positive or the most meaningful or valuable use of all of these functions. Of course, as we talked about earlier, each of these four functions does have the ability to manifest in the more shadowy or more, I guess you could say, destructive ways. So we talked about the Ace of Swords showing all of this powerful potential of your mental realm to reason and think about things logically. But again, there's also that potential for confusion or false assumptions or destructive thought patterns. That circles us back to the primary reason that I think the aces are such powerful cards And this is, again, the way that the aces show that each of us has the potential to navigate the energies of these suits with intention. Instead of letting them come up in potentially destructive ways, we can at least work towards working with these energies intentionally and letting them come into our lives in a way that is enriching and beneficial and lets us take advantage of their full potential to make our beautiful but brief experience as human beings as enriching and meaningful as possible. To me, that's one of the greatest gifts that tarot offers us is the ability to time and time again return ourselves to awareness and intention. Tarot gives us a way to consider these things that are so interesting about who we are and how we navigate the world, and hopefully come up with a more empowered way to live our lives. So, this has been our exploration of the four aces, and this concludes our epic journey through the 8 core cards of the tarot deck. I love talking about this. I have a feeling that talking about these core cards is something I'll be doing much more of in the future. I do really hope that you've gained something interesting from listening to these episodes. And if you have, definitely let me know. I love hearing from you guys. I've been getting some messages trickling in, and it makes me excited to know that people are listening. And I love hearing what you think about what we talk about on the podcast. So you can find me on my website, which is carriemallon.com. If you are on Instagram, definitely find me there. I spend a lot of time hanging out on Instagram, and my username is at Carrie Mallon. Thank you so much for being with me for this installment of the Key Finding podcast. The best way to stay up to date with new episodes is to get on my mailing list, which you can do on my website, which once again is carriemallon.com. And I always send out notifications when the new episodes go live, which happens every other week, so about twice a month. I can't wait to talk to you again next time. Until then, take care. Bye bye.